one encounters in the sprawling empire of American evangelical entrepreneurship few figures who have managed to monetize sexual anxiety with quite the industrial efficiency of Dr. James Dobson. Here is a man who has discovered that there exists, in the fevered imagination of suburban American Christianity, an apparently inexhaustible market for repackaging medieval superstitions about human sexuality as family values, and who has exploited this discovery with all the ruthless acumen of a Victorian snake oil salesman, albeit one equipped with a psychology degree from the University of Southern California, a credential he waves about as if it somehow legitimizes his wholesale rejection of actual psychological science, whenever it conflicts with his predetermined theological conclusions. The abstinence-only sex education movement that Dobson has championed with such profitable enthusiasm represents perhaps the most spectacular example of willful ignorance masquerading as moral virtue in modern American public policy. It takes a special kind of intellectual perversity to observe the mounting evidence that comprehensive sex education reduces rates of teenage pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections, and to respond by demanding that we instead double down on a program of deliberate ignorance that has failed everywhere it has been tried. But then, faith, as Dobson never tires of reminding us, means believing in things despite the evidence, or in this case, believing in things because of their demonstrated failure. Let us examine, with the dispassionate eye that Dobson so studiously avoids, what his prescribed curriculum actually entails. Young people are gathered into classrooms and youth groups where they are solemnly informed that their bodies are temples, though apparently temples whose architecture must remain a complete mystery until marriage. They are taught that condoms fail at rates that would astonish actual epidemiologists, that sexually transmitted infections are essentially divine punishment for premarital experimentation, and that the only safe sex is no sex, until, of course, a piece of paper from the state magically transforms this dangerous activity into a blessed sacrament. The intellectual coherence of this position is roughly equivalent to teaching fire safety by insisting that children should never learn what fire is until they're handed a flamethrower on their wedding day. The purity culture that Focus on the Family has so successfully marketed to anxious parents across America is a particularly grotesque manifestation of this anti-educational philosophy. Young women are subjected to elaborate metaphors, comparing them to pieces of tape that lose their stickiness with each use, chewed pieces of gum that no one would want, or roses passed around a classroom until their petals fall off, each image more degrading than the last, each designed to instill the conviction that female sexuality is essentially a depleting resource, a bank account that can only make withdrawals. The psychological violence of these metaphors is breathtaking in its casualness. What manner of sadist looks at a 13-year-old girl and thinks, what this child needs is to understand that if she explores her sexuality, she'll be worthless garbage. Meanwhile, young men are taught that they are barely controlled beasts, helpless before their own desires, dependent on women to serve as the gatekeepers of morality. This simultaneously infantilizing and predatory view of male sexuality manages the impressive feat of insulting both sexes while preparing neither for actual adult relationships. Boys learn that their desires are shameful but inevitable. Girls learn that their bodies are dangerous weapons that must be carefully controlled. And everyone learns that the opposite sex is essentially an alien species with whom communication is impossible without the mediation of carefully prescribed rules that bear no relationship to how actual human beings interact. The purity pledge ceremonies that Dobson and his acolytes promote with such theatrical fervor deserve special consideration as monuments to the confusion of symbol with substance. Teenagers are coerced, and let us not pretend that social pressure applied to adolescence is anything but coercion, into making public vows about their future sexual behavior, often in elaborate ceremonies, complete with rings, certificates, and the kind of ritualistic pageantry that would make a medieval guildmaster blush. The research on these pledges is unequivocal. Pledges have rates of sexually transmitted infections and pregnancy equal to or higher than non-pledges, largely because when they do engage in sexual activity, as the vast majority eventually do, they are less likely to use protection, having been taught that carrying a condom is essentially carrying evidence of premeditated sin. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Dobson's program is the comprehensive shame infrastructure it erects around normal human development. Masturbation, that universal and harmless practice that has occupied teenagers since the dawn of time, is transformed into a spiritual crisis requiring intervention, counseling, and earnest prayer circles. Same-sex attraction, experienced by a significant percentage of adolescents as part of normal sexual development, becomes not just a sin, but an existential threat to one's very identity as a Christian. The result is a generation of young people who experience their own bodies as enemy territory, sites of constant moral danger that must be vigilantly policed. Consider the actual consequences of this pedagogical malpractice in the real world, that inconvenient place where Dobson's theories must eventually collide with biological reality. Studies consistently demonstrate that states with abstinence-only education have higher rates of teenage pregnancy. Mississippi, that bastion of traditional values where Dobson's curriculum has found such fertile ground, boasts teenage pregnancy rates that would embarrass a developing nation. Meanwhile, those godless liberals in Massachusetts, with their comprehensive sex education and ready access to contraception, somehow manage to maintain teenage pregnancy rates among the lowest in the nation. One might think this would prompt some reflection among the abstinence-only crowd. But faith, as Kierkegaard observed, begins precisely where thinking leaves off. The treatment of sexually transmitted infections under Dobson's regime deserves its own special circle in whatever hell is reserved for those who sacrifice children's health on the altar of ideology. Rather than teaching young people how to protect themselves from STIs, abstinence-only programs often exaggerate their prevalence to terrorize teenagers into celibacy while simultaneously downplaying or outright lying about the effectiveness of barrier methods. The result is that when young people do become sexually active, and roughly 95% of Americans have premarital sex, despite Dobson's best efforts, they are more likely to engage in risky behaviors, less likely to seek testing and treatment, and more likely to spread infections to partners. This is not education. It is biological sabotage, dressed up as moral instruction. The economic dimensions of this fraud should not be overlooked. Focus on the Family has built a multimedia empire on the foundation of parental anxiety about teenage sexuality, raking in millions of dollars annually from book sales, speaking fees, curriculum packages, and donations from supporters who apparently believe that ignorance is not merely bliss, but actively holy. During the Bush administration alone, over $1 billion in federal funding was diverted to abstinence-only programs. That this money was taken from programs that actually work, comprehensive sex education, access to contraception, accurate medical information, only adds to the grotesque irony of the situation. The human cost of Dobson's crusade is written in the stories of countless young people who have been psychologically maimed by purity culture. The young woman who believes she is damaged goods because she had sex with her high school boyfriend. The gay teenager who attempts suicide rather than face the shame his church community has taught him to feel. The married couple who cannot experience physical intimacy without guilt because they've been programmed to view sexual desire as inherently sinful. These are the real fruits of focus on the family's labor. Each of these stories represents a human being whose capacity for joy, intimacy, and healthy relationships has been deliberately sabotaged by adults who should have been protecting and educating them. What makes Dobson's position particularly galling is his pretense to psychological expertise. Here is a man with a doctorate in psychology who has chosen to ignore decades of research in his own field, demonstrating the harm caused by sexual shame, the ineffectiveness of abstinence-only education, and the importance of accurate information in promoting healthy development. He is like a physician who insists on treating infections with prayer, while antibiotics sit unused in the cabinet. The international perspective on American abstinence-only education is one of bewildered horror. European nations, with their frank discussions of sexuality and easy access to contraception, watch our teenage pregnancy rates with the same fascination one might observe a car crash in slow motion. The Dutch, whose comprehensive sex education begins in primary school, have teenage pregnancy rates that are a fraction of ours, along with lower rates of STIs, and, contrary to Dobson's dire predictions, later average ages of first intercourse. But why should we learn from successful models when we can continue to fail with such passionate conviction? The damage extends beyond individual psychology to pollute the entire cultural discourse around sexuality. By framing sex as a battle between virtue and temptation, rather than a normal part of human experience that requires education and thoughtful decision-making, Dobson has contributed to a cultural atmosphere in which honest discussion of sexuality becomes impossible. Parents who might otherwise have helpful conversations with their children are paralyzed by the fear of saying the wrong thing. Teachers are prohibited from answering students' questions honestly, and healthcare providers find themselves unable to offer medical advice without navigating a minefield of religious objections. One cannot help but wonder what manner of twisted psychology drives a man to dedicate his life to ensuring that young people remain ignorant about their own bodies. Is it merely the cynical exploitation of a market niche, the recognition that anxious parents will pay handsomely for someone to validate their discomfort with their children's developing sexuality? Or is there something deeper, some profound fear of human sexuality that manifests as a crusade to ensure that everyone else shares that fear? Whatever the motivation, the result is the same. Millions of young people sent into the world deliberately unprepared for one of the most significant aspects of human experience. The ultimate judgment on Dr. James Dobson and his focus on the family empire must be that they represent a betrayal of the most fundamental duty adults have to children: the obligation to prepare them for the world as it actually is, not as we might wish it to be. In place of education, Dobson offers ignorance. In place of preparation, paralysis. In place of honesty, shame. His legacy will be measured not in the souls he claims to have saved, but in the lives he has helped to damage. The pregnancies that could have been prevented, the diseases that could have been avoided, and the psychological wounds that could have been forestalled. If only children had been given facts instead of fear. If there is any justice in the universe, poetic, divine, or otherwise, history will remember James Dobson not as a protector of family values, but as their most insidious enemy, a man who took the natural anxieties of parenthood and weaponized them against children, who transformed the beautiful complexity of human sexuality into a source of profit and power, and who left in his wake a generation less capable of forming healthy relationships than any that came before. The fact that he did all this while claiming to speak for morality itself only adds a final layer of grotesque irony to an already tragic tale. One can only hope that future generations will look back on the abstinence-only movement with the same bewildered disgust we now reserve for the Victorian practice of covering piano legs, lest they inspire impure thoughts. Though at least the Victorians had the excuse of not knowing any better.